So that means that he was at the early stages of Alzheimer's. And at that point, John asked two questions. One, he asked, can I still drink alcohol? And two, how long before I'm a vegetable? And I understood that question way better than the doctor, because John and I had talked throughout our marriage about what would we do if this happened.
Welcome to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. I'm your host, Kendra Rinaldi. This is a space to explore the full spectrum of grief, from the kind that comes with death to the kind that shows up in life's many transitions. Through stories and conversations, we remind each other that we're not alone. Your journey matters, and here we're figuring it out together. Let's dive right in to today's episode. Let's start with a quick disclaimer. This podcast includes personal stories and perspectives on topics like grief, health, and mental wellness. The views expressed by guests are their own and may reflect individual experiences that are not meant as medical advice. As the host, I hold space for diverse voices, but that does not mean I endorse every viewpoint shared. Please listen with care and take what resonates with you. Today, I am joined by Erica Baccus. She is an award-winning debut author of A Promise Kept. At 80 years old, Erica wrote a very powerful memoir about her marriage and the tender, courageous journey of honoring her husband, John's final wishes. And her story has been described as a cultural act of courage and an invitation to rethink how we approach death with honesty, compassion, and humanity. I'm so grateful to have you on the podcast today, Erica, and to talk about you, your love story, again, honoring your husband, John. So let's start with the love story. Let's start with finding out more about you and how you and John met, and we'll go from there.
Well, John and I met at work in the old-fashioned way that people used to meet. Actually, one of the first chapters of my book is called Trust Your Lust. And I just get a kick out of it. I met John on my first day at my new job. And I was standing in an area talking to my new boss. And this man comes walking up, and he's wearing these navy blue pants and a white shirt with the collar open, and very jovial and happy. And he comes up to talk to my new boss, and we get introduced. And he was a manufacturing manager at this biotech company where I was just starting to work. And he asked me, has anybody given you a tour of the company yet? And I said, no, I just gotten there. And I looked at my boss, and she said, go with him. And he took me down this long hallway and stopped and introduced me to all these different people and gave me a lovely tour, and then took me to his office, and we sat down and chatted for a little while. And then he returned me to my area, my new area. And the interesting thing is that John was married at the time, and I was living with a man. And so, in my head, this was just a nice person that did such a nice thing for me that day. But that night, I dreamt about him. And I dreamt about him in a way that when I woke up the next morning, I said, you can't dream about him. You're living with Bob, and he's married. You can't have this kind of dream. Well, 2 years later, we were dating. And it was we became good friends. We'd had lunches together, and I would talk to him about my relationship with Bob, which wasn't so great. And he just was a great listener, and he was just always so kind and funny and jovial and generous with his time. And So we started having lunches together, and then on occasion there were groups of us that would go out for drinks after work. I was 38, he was 36, and I had been married before. I had at the time, my son was 7 years old, 6 or 7 years old. And what happened was, along the way, one day I'm walking down the hallway and all these girls are standing in the hallway giggling. And I said, "What's going on? What's so funny?" And they said, "Haven't you heard? Baccus is separated." And I guess there were other people who had an eye on him.
You
And
were, yeah. So you're like, okay, this is my window.
yeah, I go, why am I the last to know? So John separated from his wife, and ultimately, I separated from the man that was living with me, and John and I started dating. It was 2 years later we started dating, 1980, and we got married in 1982. But along the way, I have to say, and I get a lot of comments from people who read my book. John broke up with me like 3 or 4 major times, um, and I understood it. I had been single for 12 years, and um, he had just become single, and I thought, he's not ready. And so whenever he broke up with me, and they were never arguments or never fights or anything like that, it was just that he needed to go away. And I would just think, okay, it was nothing hostile. And then a few weeks later, he'd call me up and he'd be back or whatever. So it was a back and forth kind of situation.
Before getting married. So during the dating time of that two
Yes.
year period, the back and forth, and then once
Once
you
we got
got
married,
married, and
we were married for 41 magical years. He was the absolute, I know people say this all the time, the love of your life. But John and I were an unusual couple. We were extremely committed to each other, and we had so much fun together. And even later in our marriage, people would comment on, we look like a new honeymoon couple. We held hands everywhere we went, walking down the street, in the movie theater. We were just extremely connected. And yet we had very independent lives. So that was an interesting component of our marriage.
I think that is very important what you just said. The having independent lives, being able to know who you are in order so that when you come together, you're not like meshed within
Right.
each other, right? So that I've heard there's this I don't know if you've ever read Khalil Gibran,
Oh,
the book
yes.
The Prophet. Okay, so my husband and I, we read two of the Khalil Gibran things during our wedding, and it's that part of like the pillars of a temple stand apart, and the cypress and the willow grow not in each other's shadow. And that's like so powerful because that's what really holds the structure of a marriage strong. So I love that you guys had that as well.
Yes.
And then what were the things that when you guys would do together that were the what were the things that you did have in common that you do together to keep this marriage with the spark?
Well, first of all, we loved talking to each other. And John was a really good listener. So that was great. I had my own business, and he had his own business, similarly to you. And we would come together in the evening and, how was your day? And how was your day? And he was always very helpful with he actually managed my finances for me for my business. But we skied together, and we played golf together, and we traveled together, and we backpacked for years and years every summer, and it was just us. We never took anybody else with us. It was just the two of us. And when you're backpacking in the Sierra Mountains, you're away and you're alone. When we were backpacking, we could just walk into the forest, ask a ranger for a permit and go. Today, it's much more complicated, and there would be nobody around us. And so every weekend we would go into the Sierras and backpack. And we also had a tradition that grew just so organically. On our first wedding anniversary, I came home from work and John says, "Go pack some clothes. We're going on a trip." Well, what kind of clothes? Just casual clothes, and bring something nice for dinner. I got in the car and there were a dozen white roses and a bottle of champagne. And he took me to the Awani Hotel in Yosemite, which is a beautiful hotel. So we weren't backpacking. It was comfortable with beds and a lovely dinner. Year 2 rolls around and I thought, gee, John was so nice last year. He surprised me with a trip. I'm going to surprise him this year. And in those days, we lived in San Jose. We didn't have a lot of money. And so I created a trip for us to go to San Francisco and stay in a bed and breakfast inn in San Francisco. That launched 41 years of anniversary trips. One year, he had the odd years that he planned it, and I was the recipient of the surprise. And then the next year, I planned it, and he was the recipient of the surprise. We did, and that was, everybody knew you leave Eric and John alone on April 17th, or around those days, because that was sacrosanct. And every year we honored our marriage. We told each other how grateful we were to be together, and just the idea of saying thank you for all the gifts that you have given me, and I don't mean things that you open up.
I love that because it was not just, yeah, a gift exchange. It was really, the trip was about spending quality time together every year on your anniversary, doing the things you loved and connecting. So beautiful. So, in the 41 years, when did you start noticing then the signs of dementia and when the things start shifting? Because that is a very, especially if you already know somebody's personality, right? And then the little
Yes.
changes that occur. So, take us into that part of the journey.
So in April in 2017, we were on a trip to Europe. And this particular day, we were in Vienna. And John was always really good at map reading. And he liked paper maps as opposed to using a cell phone and using Google Maps. So we had been touring the city, and it was time for us to go back to our hotel room. And I'm watching him, and he's got this map in his hand, and he's turning it 90 degrees and 90 degrees. And I'm thinking, what the heck is going on here? And I said to him, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" He said, "No, I'm fine. I'm fine." And he started to get more and more agitated, and he could not read the map until finally I had to take out my cell phone and use the walking directions. And the whole thing was just really odd to me. We got back to the hotel room and he was not in a good mood. And I started thinking about it. I thought, he doesn't remember when I tell him where we're going to go the next day. He doesn't remember. I have to keep repeating it. And also he was having trouble remembering what we did the day before. I didn't put two and two together. I just thought, no, this is just odd. And I thought, you know what? We're on vacation. I'll worry about it when I get home. And I was very good at compartmentalizing. When we got home, he was totally normal again. And I thought, oh, well, maybe it was just something that happened on the trip, and I'm just not paying any attention to it. But then 2018 rolls around, and I'm starting to notice that he's forgetting more and more things. It was like, if we had a date with friends, he didn't remember that we were going, or I would tell him something. So there were small things, but his memory was starting to decline. And by the time 2019 rolls around, he's starting to tell me, Erica, there's something wrong with my memory. And I say, well, John, we all have memory problems. You know, I can't remember the movie we saw last week. He says, this is different. So we go to our primary care doctor, and John tells the primary care doctor that he's worried about his memory. And he says, well, let me run you through this test. There's a standard test that everybody does to see how somebody's brain is working. And I'm watching John answer the questions thinking, he's doing better at it than I am. He completely aced the test. So the doctor says, well, you seem fine to me, but if you're really concerned about it, I'm going to put a referral into my chart that we belong to the UCSF system, University of California, San Francisco, which is an excellent, one of the best in the country medical systems. So I'll put a referral there for you for the memory care center if you become more concerned. So my sister is a nurse, and she lives in Wisconsin. And one day I was talking to her towards the end of 2019. I was telling her that I was concerned. John took this test, but I'm still concerned. He's concerned. And she says, Erica, if you're really seriously concerned, you should go to a neurologist, because if he does have dementia, excuse me, the sooner you find out about it, the better, because there are drugs that can slow it down. So I reported that conversation to John, and he gave me permission to make an appointment with UCSF. And he had to have, I made the appointment, and he had to have a brain scan. And we saw a team of doctors on January 20th, January 24th, 2020, the year of the pandemic. And we visited with there were like 5 or 6 doctors. We were there for 8 hours. And they interviewed John, they interviewed me, they ran him through a bunch of tests. And then we go into this big conference room at the end of the day. And there's this big scan of his brain sitting at the center and top of this big conference room. I'll never forget it. And the doctor, the main neurologist, basically says, we've looked at your tests and we've looked at your scan. And John, you have mild cognitive impairment consistent with Alzheimer's. Those are the exact words she used. So that means that he was at the early stages of Alzheimer's. And at that point, John asked 2 questions. One, he asked, can I still drink alcohol? And 2, how long before I'm a vegetable? And I understood that question way better than the doctor, because John and I had talked throughout our marriage about what would we do if this happened. My mother had early onset Alzheimer's. She didn't die from Alzheimer's. She died from a cardiac event at 63. But I saw what Alzheimer's did. And I told him I never wanted to live with this kind of disease. And he also, he said to me, his brain is his person. He said, Erica, my brain is my person. And if I don't have my brain, there's no reason for me to be here. I don't want to live in a vegetative state. If I can't give to everybody that I care about, there's no reason for me to be here. So when he asked that question to the doctor, I knew what he was thinking. And the story goes on from there.
Wow. So how old was he at this? So it's 2020. How old was he?
He died at 77, and that was in 2023. So he was 74.
74 when he then finds out he
Was
has
diagnosed, yeah.
Alzheimer's. Was there anybody in his family that had Alzheimer's? No.
No.
And then it's just, it's right nowadays. I feel I have a lot of friends whose parents have Alzheimer's or have died of Alzheimer's. Now it's becoming a little more common. I don't know if it's more
Yeah,
common or we
it seems
just
like,
talk about it. Yeah.
yeah, at my age, I know all kinds of people.
Yeah. At that moment, when you guys got married and when he started to his health to decline, at what point do you have, or did you already have the power? Right, I'm trying to think of the word, not power of attorney. How is it? What is the thing? The call, the
Medical,
medical. Yes, yes. Did you guys have medical power for each other? You
yes,
did.
yeah.
At what
We were
point
very
in
good
your
at having our wills and our trust and our medical directives done. And we would update them as t- situations changed in our life, when our children grew up and when we got grandchildren and that sort of thing. So yeah, we had that.
So, did you also have then each of you had your children also in the medical directive as well?
Um, yes,
Okay.
they were secondary. Yeah.
Secondary for you guys. So he gets diagnosed 74. The process then from there to then 3 years later of his passing. Take us into that journey and explain to us a little more. Then after you go into that, we'll talk then about the laws
Yes.
in the that are here in the US and so forth. So let's talk more about your own story, then we'll go into the laws.
So now remember, he was diagnosed in 2020, but in 2017 there was something wrong with him, and probably years before that, Alzheimer's was working its way into his brain. Um, so he's diagnosed, and one of the first things that John did, um, I think it was in February. I remember this. He was talking with a friend of his who is a physician and who had been in the Air Force. So, and John had been in Vietnam. So they knew about weapons. And we were in our family room having a conversation where John is asking this friend, who is also a physician, how can I commit suicide? What is the best way to commit suicide? And I'm sitting there listening to this conversation thinking, what happened to my life? This is absurd. So they go through poisoning and hanging and shooting yourself. And I live very near the Golden Gate Bridge. They even talked about jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. And with each of these, it's not easy when you're he was emotionally healthy. So when you're emotionally healthy, when you're not clinically depressed, it's not easy to consider suicide. And also he was thinking about, well, I couldn't do that. I can't, excuse my language here, but he said, I can't blow my brains out because I would leave a mess for Erica. So it's very considerate of him. Um, so that got put aside. So we're continuing our lives. John is still playing golf. He's still driving. He played golf with his friends every Thursday. He played golf with me on weekends. And we're still going out to dinner. We're still skiing. We're still doing all these things. But the interesting thing is I'm adapting to his different needs. Now all of a sudden I've got a whiteboard out where every morning I put today is March 26th, 2026. This and 1, 2, 3, exercise at 10, dinner with Tom and Cheryl, whatever. So I put all those things on the whiteboard so he has an idea of what's happening today. And then when he can't remember, he could go back and look at it. Or so that was one thing that, or I would realize, okay, I'm going to have to repeat certain things over and over again, or I'm going to have to remind him. John, one of the things that the doctor recommended is exercise that is so good for Alzheimer's. And I got him a trainer, and I would have to say, okay, today's your day with Max, and you need to wear your this outfit, the sweats and so on. So I would adapt. So there were times where I didn't really realize that things were getting worse so much. And our friends had no idea. And in the beginning, we didn't tell anyone. And even when it came to the point where it was obvious and they knew, they'd say to me, "Oh, John seems fine. He seems normal to me," because he could sit down and have a conversation at a dinner table that you would never know. But I knew, because most of the time, and this was later on, he was saying things that were simply not true. He just made things up. And I never corrected him because it didn't matter. And I was protecting his dignity. So as time went on, um, I decided to go to a therapist. I needed someone to vent to, and someone who wouldn't try to fix things for me, because you can't fix it. The thing about Alzheimer's is there's no hope. Once you get, if you get cancer, there's some hope. You can get chemotherapy, you can have radiation. With Alzheimer's, there is no hope. You're going to get worse and worse and worse until you don't remember people, you can't take care of your bodily functions, you can't swallow, you die, and that's it. And it can take years and years.
Hi, I just wanted to take a quick pause and ask that if this episode is speaking to you, I'd love for you to subscribe to my newsletter. Just go to my website, Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between, and you will be receiving some of my newsletters I send every probably couple of weeks. Also, if someone has popped into your mind and you feel that this is something they would resonate with, please send them this episode right now, because it may just be what they needed to hear. Now, let's get back to the show.
So I went to the therapist, and one day she said to me, "There's this book out that I heard about that's good for people who have Alzheimer's." She said, "I haven't read it, but you might want to take a look at it. And it's called In Love by Amy Bloom." I immediately bought the book from Amazon, and it's a how-to manual. It's how to help your husband die with assisted suicide. Amy Bloom did all this research because her husband had Alzheimer's, and he was sure he wanted to die. And they had not been married very long. And she did all the research, because you can't do it in the United States, and I can explain that later. And I read this book and I thought, this is it. This is what John wants. And it took me 3 weeks before I could tell him. One, I thought, if I tell him on a good day, I'll ruin his good day. And if I tell him when he's having a bad day, he won't be able to process the information. And the third reason was I didn't want to tell him, because I knew that if I told him, that he would choose this option. So finally, after 3 weeks, I scrunched up my courage, sat him down and said, "I have to tell you something. I read this book." And I explained what the book said. He could no longer read books because he couldn't remember what was on the page before. I would give him books to read that I thought he would like, and they would sit there. He would say, "Okay, I'm going to read this one," and then he couldn't read. But anyhow, so I told him about this book, and when I was through answering all of his questions, he said, "Okay, let's do it." And that was it. And that's what I call the beginning of the end.
And that is what year was that conversation then?
That was
When you read that book?
2022. It was 2022. It took me 2 years to find this, so 2020 to 2022.
Gosh, I'm like, just listening, it's like, it's crazy, like, to have to think that is a decision that you have to make, in a conversation that you're going to have. Like, it's unfathomable, right? It's Wow.
I swear, I feel there were times I thought, I can't believe this is my life. I mean, it was so crazy, absurd, out of the norm. And what you and your audience should understand is we didn't tell anyone.
That's what I was going to ask you, if you by chance had told the kids or anything like
No,
that.
we
No.
did not tell anyone. We knew we were going to have to tell our children and then our extended family, but we were waiting. And one of the reasons we were waiting, and we certainly didn't tell our friends. First of all, we didn't tell people. I always think about it in concentric circles, the innermost circle and then the inners and then the wider circle. And we didn't tell the wider circle because it is a very controversial topic, and I didn't know how people were going to react. And I did not want my husband, who had a brain disease, have to defend his decision. So, and I had no energy for it to ward off all of the starting from, well, he seems so healthy to me, to religious objections or whatever. And I didn't want to tell my family right away or John's family right away, because you have to get approved by Dignitas. Dignitas is the name of the organization in Switzerland. And if you tell them and then he doesn't get approved, they've been in this mode of worrying and serious sadness for no reason. So I convinced John to let's wait. And we waited before we told everybody.
Before you told, and then that waiting, there's a very fine timeline, right, of having to make that decision, where it's his decision or where it's somebody else making the decision for him, which would completely change things too, right? The outcome of things, because of the brain being,
Well,
in
now
deterioration.
you hit
Mhm.
on the entrance of the laws, and
Yes.
I'll say this: John had said to me many times, Erica, you're going to have to do this. You're going to have to decide the date for when I die because I won't be able to do it. So here's the laws, very simply stated. I don't know what Texas laws are, but there are now, I think, 13 states plus DC that have medical aid in dying laws. It's called MAID, which says that if two doctors swear an oath that you're terminal and you're going to die within 6 months, and you are mentally competent, which means that you know what you're doing, that this is your choice, and that it's your decision and nobody's influencing you from the outside, then you can participate in medical aid in dying in California and all these other states. So you can do it at home. They'll give you the drugs at home or with hospice, and you can have your family and friends around, and you can die peacefully at home in your bed with loved ones all around you. The catch is you have to be mentally competent and be able to die within 6 months. The problem is with dementia, nobody knows when you're going to die. So you can't say that you're going to die within 6 months. And you have to be mentally competent. So if you choose, so Dignitas says, we don't care whether it's 6 months or 6 years or 6 decades. If you decide, if you meet the criteria of certain diseases and you're mentally competent, then we will help you with assisted suicide. So you have to collect medical histories. John had to have 2 psychiatric exams here in the United States to prove that he was mentally competent. And it took me 7 months to collect all the data and do all the forms necessary to get approval from Dignitas. And then they give you a provisional approval, meaning that you go to Switzerland and you meet with a doctor there who then talks to him to see if he's still mentally competent. And then you get your final approval. They either send you home or you get your final approval there. So the problem with this mentally competent thing is that by definition, this is a premature death. So I don't know how much more time John would have had before he was that vegetable that he didn't want to become. But I knew for certain reasons, I knew that time was running out. John had become delusional and his status had been upgraded to on the cusp of major neurodegenerative disease. And that said to me, okay, I think we're there. I think we're running out of time. And and one of the people, my sister, I said, who's a nurse, is married to a doctor, and they were my go-to people for. They knew, we told them pretty early on, and they were my sort of support system and also my go-to people for, I think this is time. And they would say to me, you better hurry up because you're running out of time. And so that's the big dilemma. And I was smiling earlier. There was a time where John said to me, Erica, we were so smart. We were so clever in how we picked the right date. It just, it breaks your heart when you think of these things. But John was, there is a video, on the last page of my book, there's a QR code. And if anybody has the book, you can scan that QR code and you'll see a video of him. And I took the video sitting in the backyard. I went out there one day and said, just talk to me. And he started talking and he said, don't be sad for me. I'm not sad for me. Uh-oh. And he said, I've had a great life. Thanks to my little girlfriend sitting over there holding the camera. And he truly was the most gracious person in accepting his fate. And he said, I had such a wonderful life. Do I wish I had more years? Of course. He said, but for my years, I've had a better life than most anybody I can think of. And that's how he went to his end.
Oh, that's so moving. It's so moving for you to share that because there's this immense amount of detachment that has to
Oh,
be there as when you love someone, right? That much. And you had to detach yourself from your wants also, and honor his. And
honoring
that
his
takes
wishes.
honoring his wishes, yes. And that takes a lot of love and like I said, detachment and selflessness really to be able to do that. When did
You mentioned Khalil Gibran.
Khalil?
There's
Yes.
a poem in there about letting your children go.
Oh, I love that one.
Your
Yeah.
children are of you, are from you, but not of you. And I've loved that poem ever since I had a child. But I thought about it with my husband that I had to let him go. I had to let him be free. He would say to me so often, Erica, is this okay with you? Is this okay with you? And I knew that if I said no, he wouldn't do it. And all I ever answered was, John, this is your life. You get to choose what to do with your life. And I will support you regardless of your choice. And that was my love.
And what you just said right there too, because at that moment the role is of a caretaker, which is what we are as mothers, right, as parents. And so for you to relate it to that part of the children, like what it's like the archer, it's like
Mhm.
they're like the
Holding
arrow,
our
right? And you're just there holding the string. Yeah, I'm very familiar with so many of they touch the way that Khalil Gibran writes. The visuals that you have and these examples are just they're just so perfect for so many of life's situations and relationships. So when did you tell the children? At what point? And that conversation, I can't
So,
I can't even wrap my head around that conversation.
so John has a son and a stepdaughter from his previous marriage, and I have one son from my previous marriage. And um, I was visiting my son sometime in 2022. He lives in Chicago, and I like to take him away from his family and have breakfast with him often, just to steal him away. And we were at this breakfast, and it was, I don't know, it was probably February or March of 2022. And I was talking to him about John's decline. And he said to me, "Mom, have you ever considered suicide?" And I thought, you could have blown me with a feather off that chair, because I'm sitting there worried about having to tell him. And he was very close to John. And he was so compassionate. And I said, when I finally gathered my wits about me, I said, "Well, now that you've asked, let me tell you what we're planning on doing." And his response was, "You can't do this alone. I'll come with you." This is the part that just really gets to me, because my son is my hero in this story. He came with me to Switzerland, and his sole purpose was to escort me home. And I went to his home, not my home, afterwards. And he and I needed escorting, and he was so generous and kind and gentle. And so anyhow, so I tell him the story, and he volunteers to go with me. And I said, "Danny, you need to think about it. This is not going to be easy." And throughout the period of time, I would call him on occasion and say, "Do you still want to do this?" And he was always, "Yes, I'm going to do this for you." And we told John's kids his son and stepdaughter in March. So Dan was February, they were March. We were skiing together in Breckenridge, and John took it upon himself to choose that time to tell his son, and I was in the room so that I could clarify questions, because John got things jumbled up. It was very emotional. His son just was a pool of tears, and his daughter, it was just, it was totally very emotional. And then we had grandchildren. And by the way, when I told my son, I said, "You can of course tell your wife, but we're not telling other people yet." And then they came, the adult nieces and nephews, where I wrote an email to everybody. No, I'm sorry. The email was, I told them that he had Alzheimer's. I had a dinner here for my nieces and nephews who lived here, and told them then, and the sisters-in-law, and then the grandchildren. And that was probably the hardest, because the grandchildren were exceedingly close to John. We were not your typical grandparents, even long distance. We saw our grandkids every 8 weeks. We talked to them every Sunday, the four of them, and extremely close to each other, and particularly John. And we left it up to the parents to tell them, because I thought this is not something, the parents needed to do this with their children rather than us. But my oldest grandson was graduating high school that spring, and we were there for that graduation. And that was tough, because there were some final goodbyes, because that was May, and then we were going in July. However, the last weekend that we were home, I got a call from the two oldest grandkids in Chicago. And they said, Grandma, we want to come see Papa. And I said, well, Kyle, that's John's son, Kyle's coming that particular weekend. Let me check with him if it's okay with him, because he was coming to say goodbye to his father. And Kyle said, sure, bring him on. It'll make it easier. So my two oldest grandchildren came on that last weekend along with John's two kids. And they played poker, and we went out to dinner, and we took walks, and we had it was a good weekend.
Creating memories and
Mhm.
saying those, really having that quality time with each other before the travels. Wow, it is just so emotional to hear all the story. And like you said, the ages of the kids range then from the grandkids range from what?
At that time in 2023, 17, 15, I think about 8 and 10.
Yeah. So the 8 and 10-year-olds are probably different conversation had than the 15 to 17-year-olds of the parents kind of having different conversations with
Yes,
them
absolutely.
as to what was happening, right? And as they get older, then they can
Yes,
know the
absolutely.
the full story, but always with truth, which I think is so important
Me too.
too in those conversations with children. There's truth, but there's not everything revealed all at once. So, Erica, as we wrap up, because there's of course a lot of other details and questions, but all of that is in your
One thing I
book
want to
too.
add real quick.
Yes, please.
We told all of our friends. I stole something from Amy Bloom that she did. I wrote an email to everybody, and I had one friend who I had told, she was my best friend, and I told her what was happening ahead of time. And on the day we flew to Switzerland, she sent this email out to my contact list of everybody that needed to know, that we wanted to know. And at that time said we will have a memorial service on such and such a date, and they should come. So they found out through email, and some of my friends were very angry with me. And
Are
it's
there friendships that ended
no,
because of that? No.
no,
Okay.
people got over it.
They got, yeah, but a lot of it too is someone's own grief as well, right? Their own grief of
Right,
that process, right? So you had time to process and make that decision. When someone's just given that information, it's going to take some time to digest for
exactly,
themselves, right?
exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So wow, that is just so much. So again, the book is on. Let me look at the whole full title again because I want to make sure because it has the subtitle. So it's A Promise Kept, Honoring His Wishes, Embracing Our Love, and it was released in 2020 September 2025, and it's been out. And what has been the most surprising part of this journey for you as an author of sharing this story?
The surprising part to me is that as soon as I started telling the story of what happened, the immediate reaction is, where can I get your book? People want to know this story. It's an important story to talk about because we don't talk about dying. We don't talk about options. And um, and this is one of the first times I think that there's someone that's out there telling this story. And sometimes it's really hard for me to talk about it. I've been on book tours and I've been in book clubs and I talk about it. And sometimes, I get a little teary, but um, but I really believe that this is an opportunity for me to turn this tragic story into something that's beneficial to a lot of people, and I want to help these people. I've talked to people on phones and on Zoom to help them with their own decision making. I've had therapists recommend talking to me about it, so I'm very happy to do that. So the most surprising thing is how interested people are in this story.
that knowing that there are ways to have that choice, that there are ways of being able to have that choice. And again, the states that support it, the countries that do, if that ends up being the journey of
Right.
someone in their own health journey and their choice of how they want to live and how they want to die. And that is it's just so it's very, like you said, there it's so controversial because of that part of us, of the emotions that also are there. Like even just talking about it is so hard to think of having to make those choices. But for someone um, to be in a place that they can make that choice still themselves, of course, is better to, to some extent than when it's somebody else having to make that choice for them. So that's great that you have this book out there, that you've connected with other people, and your story and your love story and your journey with John and his story and his legacy is now going to impact, hopefully also making some changes as well
I hope
to
so.
certain laws too, right? That apply to these decisions that people have to make. Erica, as we wrap up, before I ask you the final question, where can people find the book? You say you do book tours, so of course, I'll link
So,
your website in the show notes. But what are the best places for
yeah, well,
people to find the
my
book?
website is ericabaccus.com, and there's lots of information on that website. But it's available on Amazon.com, and it's available. I narrate the book for Audible,
Love
um,
it.
so it's Audible and Kindle and paperback and hardcover. It's also available at barnesandnoble.com, and it's also available at your local bookstore. If they don't have it on the shelf, if you ask for it, they'll order it for you and get it for you. So
Yeah.
you can get it anywhere at any bookstore. Um, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Erica. Erica, my final question is there anything else you want to share with the listeners that I have not asked?
Um, no, I think we've covered everything. I think the one thing I'd like to say is that we take it for granted that we make our choices for when we're young. And we also make choices of how we want to live our life in our middle age. And yet, for some reason, we let the end of our lives just go as willing as it may without thinking or planning or making sure that the end of our life is how we want it to be. And John had the opportunity to have an end of life the way he wanted it to be. And I encourage people to think about it and talk about it while you're healthy, not when you're in the middle of a trauma.
And to have the support system of people around you that love you enough
Hmm.
to honor those wishes as well, like
Yes.
you and your kids were in that process. So thank you so much, Erica. Again, Erica Baccus, and the link for her website and her book are in the show notes. So thank you again, Erica.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you again so much for choosing to listen today. I hope that you can take away a few nuggets from today's episode that can bring you comfort in your times of grief. If so, it would mean so much to me if you would rate and comment on this episode. And if you feel inspired in some way to share it with someone who may need to hear this, please do so. Also, if you or someone you know has a story of grief and gratitude that should be shared so that others can be inspired as well, please reach out to me. And thanks once again for tuning in to Grief, Gratitude, and the Gray in Between podcast. Have a beautiful day.